Beneath the pale, overcast glow of Vancouver, Canada, there exists a place that time and society seem to have forgotten. A stain spanning 10 city blocks, an urban cancer known to locals and police as the low track. Here, low isn't just a geographical direction. It's a state of existence. Imagine streets where the air is heavy, a nauseating mix of open sewers, piled up garbage, and the sweet, rotten smell of burning drugs. Discarded needles glint under the dim light of street lamps, like falling stars in a particularly gloomy firmament. This is the worst neighborhood in all of Canada, a ghetto unmatched in its hopelessness. Here, between 5,000 and 10,000 lost souls battle the demons of heroin and crack, sustained by an ecosystem of crime controlled by biker gangs and Asian cartels. And walking these cracked sidewalks are the women, many of them sex workers. To society, to the system, they were ghosts, disposable beings. When one went missing, the response was a deafening silence. No one reported them absent. Or if they did, it was months later, and the police would file the case away with the cynical assumption that the woman had simply wandered off and OD'd. It was easier that way. It was more convenient. But in the late 1990s, the number of disappearances began to form a sinister pattern, a pattern nobody wanted to see. And the epicenter of this nightmare wasn't in the dark alleys of the low track, but on a pig farm about 30 kilometers away, in the quiet town of Port Coquitlam. This is the account of one of the most prolific and disturbing serial killers in North American history. This is the story of Robert Pickton. Our story could have ended before it even began. It was the year 1997, the dead of night. A man is awakened by desperate knocks on his door, cries for help sharp as glass. Cautious, he opens the door and is met with a nightmarish vision. A woman, bloodied, holding her stomach with a metal handcuff dangling from one of her wrists. Her name was Wendy Lynn Eistetter. She was one of the women from the low track. While waiting for the ambulance, Wendy, between groans of pain, told a story that seemed straight out of a horror film. She had accepted an invitation to a party at a place called the Pig Palace. There, a man had tried to have sex with her, handcuffed her wrist, and then, for no apparent reason, stabbed her in the abdomen. In a superhuman act of courage, Wendy fought back, managed to grab the knife, and in the confusion, managed to stab him in the face. Still cuffed, she fled, stumbling through the darkness until she found the house where she knocked on the door. The police were called, but the suspicion was palpable. The word of a sex worker and addict against... well, against whom? The story, however, took a macabre turn when that same night a man showed up at the same hospital with a deep knife wound on his face. His name, Robert William Pickton. In his pockets, police found a key that unlocked the cuff on Wendy's wrist perfectly. Questioned, Pickton had a ready explanation. He said Wendy attended his parties and had tried to rob him. In the ensuing struggle, she stabbed him and he, in self-defense, stabbed her back. To many officers in that room, it sounded plausible. Who would believe Wendy? Robert Pickton was released. A golden opportunity lost. The monster was set free to continue his work. To understand the mind of Robert Pickton, we need to go back in time. Born in 1949, he was the product of a family that lived and breathed pig farming for 3 generations. The Pickton family farm in Port Coquitlam was an isolated place, a world unto itself. Robert lived there with his parents, his brother David, and his sister Linda. It was an environment described by neighbors as profoundly strange. After the parents' death in the 70s, the property was inherited by the 3 siblings. Linda wanted nothing to do with it, moved away, and got on with her life. Who stayed were Robert and David. And it was then that the farm began its slow descent into chaos. The brothers abandoned large-scale pig farming, but kept some animals. The property turned into a swamp of mud and manure. The pigs roamed freely, and the brothers were always seen in filthy clothes, boots caked in dung, seeming like creatures emerged from that very mire themselves. The house was in a deplorable state, a labyrinth of filth and disorder. The turning point came when an urban developer became interested in the land. The brothers, with no concept of its real value, sold off a large portion of the property for the sum of $5 million. Suddenly, Robert and David Pickton, the two unkempt and socially awkward men, were millionaires. And what does one do with so much money? For Robert, the answer lay in recreating the only universe he knew, that of the farm. And he found a perverse way to do it. They converted one of the sheds, an old slaughterhouse, into a party hall. Thus was born the Pig Palace Good Times Society. The facade was that of an organization that threw parties to raise funds for social projects. The reality was much, much darker. The parties at the Pig Palace started around 1995 and quickly became legendary in marginal circles. They gathered up to 2,000 people, bikers, gang members, addicts, and of course sex workers from the low track. The setting was worthy of a Dante-esque nightmare. An old slaughterhouse with metal hooks still hanging from the ceiling, the floor stained with decades of animal blood, and a smell that mixed cheap beer, sweat, and death. And how did Robert recruit his guests? He had a foot in both worlds. Regularly, he would go to the low track to dispose of animal remains at a rendering plant. On these visits, he played the Good Samaritan, offering the women a refuge, money, drinks, drugs and food at his parties. For those women, hungry and desperate, the invitation was irresistible. It was a momentary escape from their daily hell. They went, unaware they were voluntarily walking into the wolf's den. Meanwhile, the list of missing women from the low track only grew. Let me name just a few, so their names are not forgotten. Rebecca Guno, 23 years old, last seen on June 22, 1983. Sherry Rail, 43 years old, disappeared in January of '84. Helen Hallmark, 33 years old, who told friends she was moving to Seattle in March of '86, but never arrived. Tanya Williams, 26 years old, disappeared in July of '88. There were dozens, perhaps 50, perhaps more, and the system turned a blind eye. The web began to unravel thanks to the persistence of one man. Bill, an employee who had worked for the Pickton brothers for years, grew increasingly uneasy. He knew about Robert's trips to the low track. He knew about the disappearances, and he had heard rumors. A guest had secretly told him about seeing a pile of women's clothing inside Robert's trailer, at least 10 purses, and several wallets with IDs that didn't belong to any woman he knew. Bill went to the police, but without the direct testimony of that woman, who was terrified and refused to speak, the authorities couldn't get a search warrant. Once again, bureaucratic machinery and indifference protected the killer. It was only in 2002, 6 years after the attempted murder of Wendy Eistetter, that the house of cards collapsed. Another employee, passing through the property, saw illegal weapons inside Robert's trailer and had the courage to report it. This time, it was a concrete accusation. This time, the police acted. With a search warrant, police stormed the filthy trailer of Robert Pickton. They didn't find just weapons. They found intimate belongings, jewelry, clothes, and identification linked to several of the missing women. Pickton was arrested on illegal weapons charges and released on bail, but the property was sealed for a thorough search. And then the investigators turned to the Pig Palace itself, the old slaughterhouse. What they found there was the final confirmation of the horror. Using advanced forensic techniques, they identified bloodstains belonging to women on the missing list. Robert Pickton was arrested again, this time on the formal charge of murder, but the true dimension of his monstrosity only came to light inside a police station cell. The investigators, knowing they needed a confession, placed an undercover officer posing as an inmate in the same cell as Pickton. Everything was recorded. On the recording, Pickton, convinced he was talking to a fellow criminal, lets his guard down. He talks about DNA, about how this time he had been sloppy. The undercover officer remarks that the best way to get rid of a body would be to dump it in the ocean. And it is then that Robert Pickton, with an air of perverse arrogance, leans in and whispers the words that would go down in history. "I did better. I used a rendering plant." He then boasts of his accomplishment. "I wanted to make it 50. I was just one short." He confessed in that cell to murdering 49 women. And what was his method? He said he would lure them to his trailer, handcuff them, and then inject antifreeze into their veins. In some cases, he would strangle them to death while the toxic substance took effect. But the story doesn't end there. In fact, what came next is perhaps the most repugnant chapter of this entire saga. After the murders, Robert Pickton, the butcher, would do with the women's bodies what he was accustomed to doing with pigs. He would take them to the slaughterhouse and dismember them with the farm tools. Body parts he considered good were mixed with pork and turned into sausage. This sausage was then served at the pig palace parties to guests, distributed to neighbors, and even donated to local orphanages. Think about the depth of this perversion. Innocent people unknowingly consuming human remains. What was left, bones, organs, everything that wasn't usable, was thrown into the rendering plant Pickton had mentioned. This machine is used to process animal remains and turn them into byproducts: gelatin for candies, components for cosmetics, feed. Robert Pickton literally turned 49 women into lipstick, into candy, into face creams. He made them disappear from the face of the earth in a way so horrific it is difficult for the human mind to process. The macabre search of the farm lasted for months. Excavating the mud and manure, police found bone fragments and teeth from at least 33 women. DNA evidence was conclusive for 6 of them. For these 6, Robert Pickton stood trial. In 2007, he was found guilty on 6 counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for at least 25 years, the maximum sentence under Canadian law. He had initially been charged with 26 murders, but the trial for the other 20 charges was stayed and later dropped. His brother, David Pickton, with his history of sexual assault and traffic crimes, was never charged with complicity in the murders. What he knew or didn't know remains a dark mystery. The case of Robert Pickton is more than the story of a serial killer. It is a devastating portrait of systemic failures that allowed dozens of women, considered disposable due to their social status, to vanish for years without anyone in a position of power caring enough. It is a somber reminder that evil doesn't always lurk in dark alleys. Sometimes it resides on a seemingly ordinary farm, dressed in mud-caked clothes, offering a false refuge in exchange for their very humanity. Wendy Lynn Eistetter, the woman who survived and whose initial courage was ignored, became a tragic symbol. She had the proof, she pointed the finger, and yet the monster was set free to claim dozens of other lives. The names of his victims, Rebecca, Sherry, Helen, Tanya, and the other 45, must not be forgotten. They were not disposable, they were people. And their memory demands that we as a society never again close our eyes to those on the margins, to the invisible. Because in the darkness, monsters like Robert Pickton are always lurking, ready to act when nobody is watching. This has been another real crime file. Be careful and remember, sometimes reality is infinitely more terrifying than any fiction.